Thank you for being here this morning. We'll get started back in Acts chapter 16, I think is where we left off last week. And we'll pick up from there. I appreciate everyone that came out to the business meeting yesterday. Those of you who were not there, see me this morning for your assignments. You have about 15 things to do. All right, Acts chapter 16, verse 1. If you'll remember, last week we finished up chapter 15. They've started back on their second missionary journey. Paul and Silas, they're going to pick up Timothy here shortly. And Luke is either with them or will join them shortly. We'll see that, I think, in verse 10. But this is the start of that second missionary journey. We need to think about what happens here, because this is a momentous journey. It takes them into Europe for the first time. The first Christian converts are going to be found here in Acts chapter 16 in Europe. So in verse 16, chapter 16, verse 1, says, Then they went on to Derbe and Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a believing Jewish woman, but his father was a Greek. Okay, and we talked about this verse some last week, I think, where we talked about Timothy being a young man. There is conflict among the scholars about his age. I'm going to say early 30s here, maybe a little bit younger than that. Probably converted during the first missionary journey through this area, and he would have been 4 to 5 years younger at that point when he was converted. But Timothy is a young man that the brothers in verse 2 at Lystra and Iconium spoke highly of. There are people that we speak highly of, aren't there? We know people that we respect, that we appreciate, that we recommend to others if they need help with something. We all know people like that, and Timothy was apparently one of these guys that, even though he may have been relatively young, he was well respected by the Christians at Lystra and Iconium. He was evidently using his gifts that God had given him in service to the church in those two places. Lystra and Iconium, Lystra and Derbe are 60 miles apart. Iconium is mentioned is about 20 miles from Lystra. So these Lystra and Iconium, he would have been able to work back and forth between if he was from Lystra or Iconium, either one. We don't know for sure where he was from, but he was from this area undoubtedly. So 20 miles is something they could do in a couple of days. Timothy could go back and forth between them. He could work with both churches, doing different things for those churches. And what does this do for Timothy now? That he's been converted, he's working amongst the churches there. What does that prepare him for? It's going to prepare him to go on this missionary journey. Do you think Paul would have been willing and able to take Timothy along on this journey if he wasn't already converted? If he wasn't already studying, if he wasn't already working with the churches, teaching, maybe preaching, who knows? But if he wasn't doing that work already, he wouldn't have had the respect of the churches at Lystra and Iconium. And odds are he never would have met Paul and never would have gone on this journey. Go ahead, David.
Always been curious to me. You don't have any record of the late God. Don't remember any record. Timothy asking any questions, he just always went. Because Paul said let's go.
Right. And you saw that with the apostles too. When Jesus called them, they didn't ask questions; they just got up and went.
Nobody said anything about how we're going to eat, how we're going to do this, how we're going to do anything. They didn't know anything about that.
Right. We're going. Yeah. There's a tremendous amount of faith in that, isn't there? To take off and move to a different area or go traveling on a trip that we don't know what the future holds.
It's a blank check.
Yeah.
It's blind faith.
It's blind faith is what it is. You ever decided you were going to pack up your house and move, you just didn't know where, so you just take off driving and stop somewhere? That's kind of what we're talking about here. And Dustin's talked before about he doesn't go on a trip without having a GPS outlined and the hotel to stay in and idea of which restaurants they're going to eat in. we plan for that stuff, don't we? We prepare for those trips. There's no evident preparation here for this trip. Paul and Silas have an idea in mind that they're going to go back to all of these places that they visited on the first missionary journey. They have a plan. That plan doesn't work out. That plan is not going to unfold the way they expect it to. And so you have to move on faith. I don't know if I would have that level of faith, just to be honest with you. I'm kind of a coward. I don't know if I could move to a place and not know people, and move to a place where the culture is foreign to what I'm used to live amongst people that I never met before, never hung around with before. We took that trip to Europe, and we got immersed in different cultures and in different ways of eating and living. That was all right, but I knew I was coming home. I knew that I would be back here amongst people that are sane and amongst people that live the way I live. It's a whole different mindset to go out and say, okay, I'm just going to follow. You tell me where to go, and that's where I'm going. And I don't know if I'm coming back or not. Go ahead, Lowell.
Well, it's not that bad, really. When a hillbilly goes over to the Texans, you get used to it.
Or the other way around.
Or the other way around. It can be. It can be just fine, can't it?
That's a different deal.
Yeah, it's a whole different ball game.
And I've done that all my life. She's not.
Mm-hmm. It's a different personality type, isn't it? The adventurer versus the non-adventurer.
I'm pretty sure the Holy Spirit had something to do with that, too.
I bet the Holy Spirit had a big role in this, don't you? In giving them the confidence that they needed to go on and do the things that were to be done. I have zero doubt that we have less than a full representation of the Spirit's activities in the earth while this was happening. We have a record of the Holy Spirit coming and speaking to Paul or the apostles or to Jesus or different places at different times. We don't have them all. So I wonder how many times the Spirit came down and said, you're doing the right thing, keep going, we're on the right track. I just wonder. We have no record of that. But I just wonder how many times that had to happen. How many times the apostles and the leaders of the early church had to kind of have a pick-me-up, an attaboy, you're doing good, keep it up kind of thing. Because it would be hard to not be discouraged sometimes. There's no doubt he strengthened them. Yeah, absolutely correct.
Well, there are verses that indicate that he told them it's going to be rough.
Mm-hmm.
Don't worry, I'm watching over you.
Right. So it's one of those things that we imagine these guys being out there just doing this stuff on their own, unplanned, unsupervised, but it's not that way. It wouldn't be that way for us either. But it's just easy to think that. All right, so verse 2, the brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke highly of him. Verse 3, Paul wanted Timothy to go with him, so he took him and circumcised him. What was in the letters that Paul was delivering to the churches? You don't have to be circumcised. So why did he circumcise Timothy? It tells us here is because of all the Jews who were in those places. Since they all knew that his father was a Greek, so he wouldn't have been circumcised. But if Paul is delivering letters saying you don't need to do this, then why Timothy?
Well, for one thing, it allows Timothy to go into the temples.
It does, doesn't it?
And do the preaching
Right.
on the fall.
It's a practical concern, isn't it? It's not necessary in terms of his salvation. It's not necessary in terms of his Christian walk. But if he wants to be able to reach the people he needs to reach, he's going to do it. It is a matter of expediency that he be circumcised. It is a matter of not placing a stumbling block in front of Jews that didn't need to be there. So we've talked before about how we sometimes have to decide who's going to get the stumbling block, don't we? when people don't agree on something, and we have to make a choice between one or the other, we're deciding who to place a stumbling block in front of. You know, go ahead, Larry.
Probably one of the reasons that we learned is in 1 Corinthians 19, chapter 9, verse 19 and 20.
What does that say there?
It says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, through not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law."
Right. And you read my mind because I've already had that in my note, that verse there. Because that is what Paul did, didn't it? Isn't it? He did what was necessary to reach souls that he could convert. So if he needed to not eat meat, he didn't eat meat. If he needed to dress a certain way, he would dress a certain way. If he needed to do something different, he would do something different. He's not holding Timothy to any higher standard here than what he held himself. Well,
And that's not the only time he made that statement. That
No.
he would become all things
to all people, right?
They walked that line.
Mm-hmm.
Never fell off on the top of the thing. If you walk the line of still being who he was, but still identifying who he was trying to say.
Okay, so David mentions that he walked the line of doing what he needed to do to reach people without falling off and going into sin, right? And that's what I ask us down here. How far do we take this today? You know, Paul is being all things to all men to save a soul. So how far do we take this today? You know, I know of a Christian ministry that meets in a local bar in an effort to reach the alcoholics and the people that gather there to drink. So they serve up their mission works in the local bar. Do we do that? You know, do we?
That takes a lot of faith.
It takes a lot of faith, it takes a lot of conviction, it takes a lot of ability to stand up to temptation, doesn't it?
Yeah, I can imagine myself at a bar trying to coax someone into, look, it's not my brother.
Yeah.
That would be,
That'd be tough, wouldn't it?
yes, it would.
That would be tough.
I don't know that I could do that.
Yeah.
Prison ministries that are around.
You know, we've got prison ministries. Yeah. We've got prison ministries that, you know, you're not going in there and living side by side with a prisoner from day to day, but you're going in there and teaching and preaching. You know, Nikita does that. She's very active in prison ministry up in Fort Smith, and there have been baptisms because of her work with the ladies' prison up in Fort Smith. And so we do what we need to save souls, but we don't cross that line, do we? So, as Lowell mentioned, he can't imagine going into a bar and trying to convert people. Alcohol is zero temptation for me. Can't stand the smell of it, can't stand the taste of it. It is zero temptation. I could be in a bar for 3 weeks straight and never drink a drop of alcohol.
Well, that wasn't the reason I was doubting.
Right. It's just the difficulty. Yeah.
People, when they get alcohol in them, they're not as stable
Right.
as you would want them to be
Right.
when you're trying to talk to them.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But there are other people that for them the alcohol will be a major temptation. And they should never ever set foot in a bar. What were you saying, Suzanne?
Some of them get belligerent.
Yeah. Some of them get belligerent and hateful, and you know you kind of got to have a thick skin to do stuff like that. But you know we don't need to do those things, do we? We don't need to become an alcoholic. We don't need to become a thief. We don't need to become a prisoner in order to reach those that are in those situations. We can do it in other ways. So what Paul did here was something that really didn't matter in the grand scheme of things, did it? Being circumcised, not being circumcised doesn't make any difference when you're looking at the salvation of a person's soul. But being a drunk or a thief or converting to a different religion takes things to a different level, doesn't it? It crosses a line where we may not come back and where we may find ourselves in risk of losing our own soul. And so those are things that we don't want to do. We want to make sure that we keep our soul secure. To put it in more modern terms, if Melissa and I were to move, and the only church in the area were a non-class church, or a church that insisted it was wrong to mix their funds with funds from other churches when considering Mission Works, one of the quote-unquote non-supporting churches, how would I handle it? Would I start my own church? Not likely. I'm not that stubborn and persistent. Would I go into that church and say, I need to teach a class. We need to have a class here. We need to teach a class and start stirring up strife and division and setting one against the other and finding my new church from amongst this other church because I've stolen half their members. If it's a non-supporting church, I go in and try to get them to support a orphan's home or something like that. Well,
How do you think Paul would answer that question?
how do you think?
I was trying to think, what would Paul say to that very situation? How would he deal with that? Would he go along and on his own do the things that he thinks is right as far as contribution to other children's homes and stuff
Sure.
like that? I couldn't answer.
So let's put Paul in our shoes, okay? And I don't pretend to know the mind of Paul. I am not that intelligent and wise, okay? But if I were in that situation, if Paul were in that situation, Paul says he becomes all things to all people, so that he may save a few. So does he go? These souls are already saved now. These are members of the church who differ on mechanics of the Christian life. Okay, they differ on how do we do what we've been commanded to do. Is it okay for us to have a Bible class, or should Bible classes be done at home and it just be a worship service at the church building? It's not. It's not a matter of salvation, is it? It's not. So, do I believe that our funds in this congregation should never be under the control of the eldership of a different congregation where they might be misused? Or do I forgot where I was going with that. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that was kind of out of
Yeah, I was going somewhere weird with that.
But I did, in my mind, work out some things that I think Paul would do.
Okay, what are those? Mm-hmm.
I think he would ask a question. Help me understand why you feel this way.
Mm-hmm.
Show me
Show me in Scripture.
Show me where I can understand this better.
Mm-hmm.
And I think eventually he would change the whole church.
He would probably change all their minds, wouldn't he? Because he's such a persuasive speaker. Yeah. That would be one thing that I would do. I would sit down and discuss with them why they do what they do, which I've already done. I mean, I've talked to leaders in churches that are of this conviction. So I kind of know why they do what they do. But I wouldn't want to know specifically why that church does what it does. Would I go in and try to split the church? No. In no way would I want to split a church, ever. This is matters of conviction. This is not matters of doctrine or salvation. I could go in and worship with that church and be just fine. I would be just fine. Now, if the leaders of that church came to me and said, we think it may be time to start some Bible classes. What are your opinions on this? And I would jump all over that. We would be having a major discussion about why we should be doing that. If individuals came to me and asked me about that, I would talk to them, but I wouldn't try to split the church because church unity is critical. We see it discussed over and over in our New Testaments, particularly in the letters to the churches. Paul encourages church unity over and over and over and over again. So would I try to split the church? No. I would pray long and hard for wisdom on how best to handle it and how best to serve God in the circumstance in which I found myself. Clinton had it first, and then we'll come back to David.
Well, if the leaders of that church came to you and expressed that, the first thing I think you have to do is
And so that's what part of the conversation we'd have to have, and whether or not the leaders of that church believe it would split that church.
It's almost a no-win, because somebody's gonna leave.
Yeah, quite possibly. You know, so that's part of the conversation you have to have is how well do we know our members? How well do we know the people of our church? Is this something that's going to split them down the middle? And we have to make that decision and do the best we can. Sometimes elders have to make unpopular decisions to do the right thing. And so we have to decide how far we're going to push this. Is this something we need to push? Is it something we need to back off on? And that's the role of an elder. Go ahead, David.
Sometimes, if you can't tolerate what's there, and you're not gonna change it, instead of split the church, you need to
Go elsewhere. Sure. Absolutely. Go.
You know, when Paul went to these cities to correct some of their actions, he wasn't there just there a couple days.
No.
A month, 2 months, maybe 6 months.
Right.
There are some places he stayed almost a year.
Mm-hmm.
And when we read about his missionary journeys, we think, yep, hopping one town
Well,
to
sure.
the next.
Sure.
That's not quite the way it went.
No. You know, we talked about that last week some when we looked at the map of this journey and talked about just straight travel time was 180 days, much less the time he spent in each town that he stopped at along the way. So this journey took years. You know, if we're going to do stuff like this, when find ourselves in a place where we need to worship at a church that their mechanics of worship and service are just a little bit different than ours. You know, you don't make changes right away. You don't go in right away saying, we need to do this different, we need to do that different. It's the same way when you start a new job. You don't go in on your first day and say, well, this is stupid, you need to do this other way. Yeah, it doesn't work out, does it? You try that and it doesn't work very well. You wait until you've been there a while to see how things work, and then you start trying to maybe implement a few changes here and there. But we don't just jump into that stuff. Paul didn't do that, and we wouldn't do that either.
We wouldn't think, well,
What now?
we wouldn't think, well, somebody came here and said, change this and change it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we wouldn't take it very well.
You can't expect that to.
Right. Yeah, we wouldn't take it very well if someone came in here and tried to tell us that we couldn't have fellowship meals anymore. We wouldn't take it very well if they tried to come in here and told us we had to use 1 cup instead of a bunch. That might be one where I had to draw the line. I don't know if I could do a 1 cup. You know, I'm not sure I could handle that.
Bring your own.
Yeah, probably just bring my own. Doug? Sorry, you need to go across the street. You know, there are lines we have to draw, and there are lines we have to cross, and then there are lines we need to remove. And it takes wisdom to do all that. And that's, you know, I said when you hear me pray up here, just about every time you're gonna hear me ask for wisdom. Just about every time. Go ahead, Doug.
You know, some churches don't have class for kids, why is that?
Because they think it should be done at home. Because there's no biblical example of children being taught separately from adults. And so they don't believe the church should do it, but it should be occurring at home.
Well, we've always had class in some of this college.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, it's a difference in mechanics. It's a difference in belief of how we should do things. And,
But when it comes to doctrinal
right.
issues,
That's when we draw the line, is at doctrinal issues. So, you know, it's one of those things like I said, it's all about wisdom. It's all about knowing where it's okay to place a stumbling block and where it's not okay to place a stumbling block. Because if Doug comes in here and says what he just said and says, you know, we need drums and a piano up there on that stage or I'm going elsewhere, what are we going to do? Are we going to place a stumbling block in front of Doug, or are we going to place it in front of the rest of you that's going to drag him across the street kicking and screaming? You know, we have to decide where we're going to place those stumbling blocks, because if we decide between 2 people, there's going to be a stumbling block somewhere. And how?
Pretty easy challenge, though.
That one was easy. Yeah.
Because you say, well, show me the Bible.
Right.
Show me where the first
Yeah.
Christian church did that.
Right. So there are questions that are easy to solve, like the musical instrument one. And then there are questions that are not so easy to solve, like the multi-cup versus 1 cup. So we just, like I said, we have to pray for wisdom and the guidance of the Spirit to help us with this stuff, because we won't figure it out on our own and do it right. David?
Did Paul, talking about stumbling block,
Mhm.
did Paul
Oh, I'm sure they did. Absolutely.
He would be openly asked.
Absolutely. They're not backwards about asking about that stuff. They don't hesitate at all. So they would assume first and then say, if you are circumcised, you're going to have to prove it to us. Because his father was Greek and everyone knew it. So yeah, he'd have to prove it one way or the other. Well,
You brought up the one cup issue. There is no example in the New Testament church of a one cup example or multi-cups.
Right.
When Jesus offered that to his apostles, the church had not been developed yet. He had not been raised from the dead, so
Right.
Christianity didn't exist until after that.
right. So, you think about this stuff and you have to decide exactly how you're going to handle it. There's a lot of freedom in our service to God. There are a lot of things that we aren't told specifically how to do them. We aren't told to have a heated and air-conditioned building, but we do it anyway, don't we? We aren't told to have cushions on our pews, but here we sit on nice, comfortable pews. No songbooks were commanded. No microphones were commanded. No Facebook stream or YouTube was commanded. We have to use our intelligence, don't we? God gave us brains for a reason. He expects us to use them and to know what we can do and what we need to do in order to spread the word. Lowell asked a minute ago, what would Paul do in a certain situation? What do you think Paul would do if he were here today? Would he have a Facebook page? Would he have a YouTube stream up and going? He'd do whatever it took. He'd have a radio program. He'd have a TV program. You couldn't get away from Paul if he were here today, because he would be out there on every possible service out there. He'd have a Twitch something. He'd have a Twitter something. I don't pay attention to most of that stuff, Instagram, but he'd be on all those platforms. And he would be engaging with people. And he would be converting people using those platforms. Paul was a incredible ambassador for Christ. One that had the power of the Holy Spirit behind him that could do incredible things. All right. So that's verse 3, folks. We have to think about these things because it's very practical for our daily lives and how we live as Christians, how we do the work that God has called us to do, things that we need to think about. So verse 4, as they traveled through the towns, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and the elders at Jerusalem for them to observe. So they were passing around this letter, probably leaving copies of it in every town that they went to. The decisions reached, just as an interesting side note, I don't know that it means anything, but it was something pointed out by one of the commentators, and I verified it. The Greek word for the decisions reached here is the exact same word used for judge in Matthew 7:1. So ponder that for a little bit and see what you can make of it, because I'm not sure what to make of it myself. It's just an interesting use of the same word in two different meanings. Decisions reached. Decisions reached. It's the same Greek word as a word for judge in Matthew 7:1.
That tells me they had the final.
They had the final say. Yeah. They had the power to decide that. They had the final say. But it's the same word. Verse 5, so the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily. So we think about this strengthening in the faith, and we talked about this a little bit last week, and we'll continue to revisit this again because we all need to be strengthened in our faith. So where do we strengthen ourselves if we want to strengthen ourselves? You start at the foundation, don't you? There's a principle in the rehab game where you start at the core and then you move out if you're going to strengthen. Because if you don't have that proper base of support, then strengthening the extremities will not matter because you won't be able to hold yourself up. So this here is talking about strengthening our core, strengthening the foundations of our faith. The same thing here, this word for strengthened is only found in one other story in your Bible, and we looked at it a while back. It's the story in Acts chapter 3 and verses 7 and 16 where the lame man was healed and there was strength brought to his ankles. It's the exact same word. So think about this as a strengthening of our base of support, a strengthening of our foundation. Another thing I hadn't noticed until this morning was that this says the churches increased in number daily. So I don't know if this is just the number of new converts that are growing, or if there's actually new churches developing as a result of this work. I think it's easy to say it's both. But they were growing in faith and in number daily. So in verse 6, they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia and were prevented by the Spirit from speaking the message in Asia. So if we go back, let's pull up that map again. Well, there it is. All right, so let's see here. I'm having trouble orienting myself on this map, but here we go with Iconium and Lystra. They're in the middle of the screen. Derbe's there as well.
I don't think that's the right map.
I don't think it is either. Yeah, it's not the right map.
Starting in Antioch and then heading.
Yeah, that's not the right map. Love it when it does that. All right. I am saved by the bell. Isn't that great?
My footnote says the Roman province of Asia.
There it is. That's the right map.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
The Roman province?
Yeah. Rome controlled most of Asia.
Yeah, big province.
It was a big province, yeah. Rome did control most of Asia. And we're going to see the Roman rule come into play here in just a minute, the Roman law. And so we see here they left from Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe and went up to Antioch. And then their plan was to come back down south and hit Pamphylia and Lycia again, and all those churches down below there. But instead, what the Spirit makes them do is go up north, up through the very tip top of Asia, over across to Mysia, and then over to Troas. And Troas is where we're going to see Luke either join them or pick up the conversation as if he's there with them, because he starts using the first person speech. But they had to skip over all this stuff in Asia. It's interesting that they didn't visit those 7 churches down there. Those 7 churches are the 7 churches of Asia mentioned in Revelation, where he takes them to task. Where there's letters delivered to those 7 churches, taking them to task for things that are less than ideal. I wonder if Paul had dipped down into those churches here on the second missionary journey, whether some of that could have been avoided. I just don't know. But anyway, we'll see them take that journey, and we'll pick that up there next week. Then this is as good a stop of place as any. Wait a minute, we won't pick it up next week because I will be preaching next week. David will preach or teach. You don't want to preach for me, do you? I'd be willing to let you now. David will teach next Sunday. And then the Sunday after that, Mike Brewer has agreed to teach because Melissa and I will be out of town. So we'll have Mike up here in 2 weeks. So I'll see you back here in about 3 weeks' time, and we'll pick it up from there. Thank you for your attention and your comments.